I do find that ACL does a great job of providing the statistics behind both of those so that you can utilize ACL pretty effectively to get the job done for you. So let's continue on here. So what is sampling in the first place? And just looking at all the good books out there on the topic, what is it? Sampling is the practice of selecting individual items from a population to estimate properties of that population. And we're going to do that given some confidence levels around error patterns and what you expect to happen. So the real thing here is that it's statistical. It isn't judgmental or non-statistical sampling. When I talk to a lot of auditors, what I find is that a lot of what they do is non-statistical. It's judgmentally selecting a bunch of items just by their eyeballs, and not to say that that is a bad thing, because you don't want to use the computer completely. I think it's still a good idea to scan the data before you actually run your sample. But what's nice about a statistical sample is that it is going to allow you to extrapolate and to make more of a judgment against that whole population. So again, to estimate properties of that population, because you're calculating and estimating based on these confidence levels and what you're expecting, and then what you're able to kind of accept from an error pattern point of view. So again, this was the main definition out there. Let's take a look at the steps that you would go through when going through a sample, no matter if you're doing monetary unit sampling or record sampling, because they're kind of the same thing. Actually, when you look at monetary unit sampling, what all the good books will tell you is that it is a form of attribute sampling. So it isn't something that is completely off the mark from all of the sampling techniques that are out there, and it's actually kind of very much in line. So the 7 steps here: set the audit procedure. I want to say I got these 7 steps and modified them a bit from a great book that we'll be showing later, which is Sampling for Internal Auditors, and you can buy it on sale from the IIA right now. For some reason it's on sale, but again, we can talk more about that in a minute. Anyway, the 7 steps here. We're going to set the audit procedure and the objective of that audit procedure, which drives your attributes for testing. Something, let's imagine we were taking a look at accounts payable and procurement, and we wanted to take a look for each accounts payable invoice. Does a purchase order exist for each invoice? Yes, no. That would be one attribute. You may want to pick another one, such as especially if you have the same level of confidence in each one of these tests. Another thing you might want to say as well, that the purchase order was filled out prior to the invoice showing up, because that happens a lot where invoices show up and then people go, ooh, I need to get a purchase order for this. So that would be kind of the next yes, no. And you can have various attributes like that that you're assigning to that. The other thing from a monetary unit point of view is that you may want to look more at whether or not that value is over or understated. And again, give confidence levels on, based on some testing, I believe that accounts receivable is not overstated by this amount, and I have this much confidence, and all that stuff. So we'll talk more about that in a second, but you can kind of see the difference here of, is it a yes-no question, or is it a value being over or under? But again, when you look at yes-no and over and under, their attribute testing and monetary unit testing is very, very similar. So then you're going to set the population. And you could set the population, as most people do, as the entire population of, let's say, accounts payable invoices. You could do it for just 1 year and say we're just auditing a year. You could start stratifying that population and saying, anything over a certain amount, we're going to put in one bucket. Another, bucket will be the middle part, and another bucket is the small stuff. And for each one, we're going to have a separate sort of sampling approach. I mean, there's nothing to say that you couldn't have a judgmental approach for the small dollars, because they don't, let's say in aggregate, they don't add up to very much. You could decide to not sample it, or just, judgmentally pick a few, or do a random pick, but it doesn't have to kind of meet all of the statistical guidelines. But now as you get to the larger ones, you might want to then say, hey, why don't we go to the statistical guidelines so that we can do more of an estimation based on that population. So just trying to give you some ideas here of what we'll talk about as we look at these steps. And next one is select a sampling method. I think it is going to tend to be more of a, is it a control that you're testing? That's more record sampling, random, fixed interval, cell, or is it dollars that you're sampling? That's going to be monitor unit. You're going to calculate a sample size, which really good is that we're going to talk through all of the inputs there. And again, this is where the math comes into it, and this is where I am not very good. So I use the computer. I don't know about you, but I have a calculator next to me, and I use it constantly because I like to add up things and would rather use my calculator than my brain to do it. So calculating that sample size is something that ACL will do a very good job of. We can then go audit the sample, which will be done obviously manually by pulling records, taking a look, talking to people, etc. And then we're going to evaluate the sample, which will also be done in ACL. So the evaluation part is where you're going to essentially put in the inputs from the sample size selection, put in your outputs from the audit, the sample part. Did we have any errors? Were there any purchase orders that were not set up prior to the invoice? If so, that's a bad thing. We put that in there as an error, and then you evaluate the sample based on that error approach. Okay, so just moving onward here. Types of sampling. We've been kind of touching on this a bit over and over again as we start off here, so just wanted to show you these are the three types. It's attribute, control, record, sampling. It's like all these different names for the same thing. And within that, you have options. You have a random, a fixed interval, and a cell. Random is, let's just say you had a population of 1,000. It is going to randomly pick, say, 10 items from the 1,000. And it's just going to randomly do it. There's no order. For the most part, ACL will not allow repeats in there, so from the you won't pick a sample of 10 and get 4 because all these repeats keep showing up. So you have to make sure of that. And then from a fixed interval point of view, the fixed interval is something where it will go through and start, let's say, at the number 12. And fixed interval of 50 through that item, or let's say it was 10, it would start at 0, let's say, and go every 100 and pick 10 items based on the 1,000 divided by 100. And the last one is more of a cell where it's going to pick that interval. So it's picking the 0 to 100 or 1 to 100 in that case. And then it's going to calculate a random sample within that one strata. And then it goes from 101 to 200, and then again does a random sample within there. And that's a little bit, it feels like it's a better thing to do. Statistically, it tends to be all the same, but I find it's a little more useful in that the fixed interval, you could start kind of picking things that are the same because they just show up in the data every 100th time. Whereas the cell, it's going to be a little more random, but yet, get more of a stratification of that population before it does it. So that's nice. And again, monitor unit, PPS sampling, we'll talk more about it, but essentially it's where the dollar unit is the unit in the sample. So the actual dollars in that case will be your unit that you're then working through. So $1 million item has $1 million more of a chance of being selected than a $1 item. And so on and so forth. So and the goal of that, because it's focusing on these larger items, it really does work more towards the evaluation side of things. So that's kind of where that's kind of, or sorry, over and under evaluation of things. Stratified sampling is going to be by amount or by transactional score, and I kind of threw that in there. Most people just do it by amount, maybe by department type, by employee type, but I threw in the transactional scoring part because I think that it's useful to start risk scoring your transactions and then looking at it from that perspective. And again, we'll spend about 20 minutes or so later at the end of the broadcast to talk about that and how you can do it. And I show how to do it mostly in Excel with ACL kind of, mixed in there as well. So that should be useful for you. Let's move on though to the hardest part, in my opinion. And I had to read various books, which I'll be showing you soon, so you can see. But for the most part, is what are the different types of inputs that go into the ACL calculation. And the good books kind of call it all these different names. So as you go through these things, I tried my best to give all the definitions in one place so that you can make your assessment. And I'm just going to scroll to it quickly here. This is what ACL is going to ask for. So ACL is more or less asking for, from a record point of view, this confidence, population, upper error limit, expected error limit. And then from a size point of view on the monetary, confidence, population, materiality now, and then expected total errors as well in there. So you'll see, we'll talk more about that, but that's kind of what ACL calls it. Let's go back to what everyone calls it and kind of see how it relates. So for the most part, you have a population which is in a record sample, either your number of records, or in a monetary unit sample is more of, say, the dollars in a particular field, accounts payable, accounts receivable, inventory. Then you have a confidence percentage, and the confidence percentage, some people will call it beta risk, is another name for this. And beta risk is the inverse of confidence. So it's basically the risk of incorrect acceptance, so that there's a 5% chance that I'm going to do this wonderful sample, and at the end of it I'm going to make a bad calculation or a bad estimation, and in essence incorrectly accept that population had proper controls around accounts payable. So that beta risk of, say, 5% or 10%, that is the inverse of confidence. And confidence would say, I'm 90% confident that by doing this statistical analysis of accounts payable spend, that these particular invoices that I'm testing for purchase orders are controlled. And I'm assuming then, as we move through this, that the upper error limit, that there's not, let's say, a percentage, how many errors can I withstand? I believe that the error percentage is less than 3%. So out of 1,000 items, you basically 30 items will have a problem with this whole purchase order to invoice scenario. Or from a dollars point of view, you put it in as a dollar amount. So you actually say, from a materiality point of view, my upper error limit in this case is, let's say, 250,000, and that is the maximum amount that I'm willing to kind of bet on in my 90% confidence calculation. And again, it goes by some different names here depending on which book you read, so I tried my best here to give you a bunch of ideas. Then the expected total errors, it would either be an error rate and an error value. So what you also are saying is that the error, it could be in there, that there is, let's say, I expect at least 1% to be in there, but I do not expect more than 30. So it's kind of a low and a high of what you're expecting in the data. Then there's either an interval that's going to be calculated, which is either going to be more of a random kind of interval, or it's going to be an interval, which is something that is set, a fixed interval. And then you have the number of errors that you can tolerate, which is basically what's going to calculate from this. So from a sampling point of view, it's going to say to you that you're able to withstand, this many errors based on this population size and sample size, etc. So did my best here to try to explain each one of these. This is the input now in ACL. So if we're doing a record sample, we'll do this in practice, but 90% confident would go into the confidence section. Population of, let's say, 1,000 records. My upper error limit percentage, I believe there's less than 3% maximum of an issue, but I do expect a 1% expected error rate. It's kind of, and then it's going to calculate your number of tolerable errors, your interval, sample size, and then on the monitor unit side, it's more in kind of a dollars terms, but again, still giving you the same types of information. Okay, sampling size example and expectations. This is giving you now the example, and again, just to repeat above, we are 90% confident that the population error rate does not exceed the upper error limit of 5% with an expected error rate of 2%. So if I, with a 134 item sample, interval of, depending on how big the population is, in that case it's 37, the number of tolerable errors is 3. So I can actually, as part of my 134 unit sample, if I find more than 3 wrong, I'm in trouble. And that's essentially what I need to look for. And so again, as we continue through this, what I find interesting is that based on statistics here, and this is where the math comes in, and I'm not as good at this, but it almost doesn't matter if you had 500,000 items or 5,000 items. They tend to kind of come up with the same sample size for that. And I'm sure there's a point in there where the population, if it's 500 million, you need to do a little bit more than 134. I didn't test that though. But in this case, I do find it very interesting that you're almost better off sometimes going with a larger kind of random sample and just going across it all, because then you can extrapolate based on that larger sample. It's not like more records leads to more sample size. So let's talk about what does reduce sample sizes in our analysis. And the first thing that reduces sample size is increasing the upper error limit. So if you're willing to withstand a much higher limit rate, you're basically going to get a lower percentage. You could reduce confidence. So you could say I'm 70% confident, and again, that's going to give you less sample. You could reduce your expected error rate or number. I mean, you don't want to, on one hand, you don't want to say, yeah, we expect 10% error rate, because it's probably going to come back with a massive sample, but you want to put something in there. You don't want to keep that blank, for sure. And then you want to remove items that can or should not be tested, and that I think saves a lot of time. What's really even said in some of the books is, if you do come upon like a voided invoice transaction, you really should throw it out and pick another one at that point. And that can get annoying. Can I do that manually now, judgmentally? Do I just randomly select one? That's probably the best thing to do, by the way, is just randomly select one. But it does get a bit messy versus just going with that sample after you've cleansed it. So you do want to think about cleansing that data of voids and canceleds and things that you just know won't be supported. Okay. And just continuing onwards, so we've got our size, we do our sample, we then had let's say in this case our points of 95% confident of a population of 20,000, that the error rate will not exceed 5%, which I guess is about 1,000 items, but that the expected error rate is at least 200 items, right, or 2,200 items in there. So based on that, my sample size is 95, interval of 210, but now the number of tolerable errors is 1%, is 1 in this case. So if I have more than one error, I'm going to have a problem. And when you evaluate an ACL, which you can kind of see on the left-hand side there, again, I'm just trying to show you what we're going to do in a few minutes. You can kind of see there that one error on that sample size and confidence turns out to an upper error limit frequency of 4.75. And if I put a sample size of 95 in there, one error actually comes out to 4.99. So it's like right under that 5% limit. So again, it's a way to evaluate your samples and just kind of showing you the results here. And keep in mind, I mean, if you do a sample of 95, based on what I'm looking at here, and you find just more than one wrong, you've blown your sample, and you need to redo the sample, kind of redo the criteria of what you expect and confidence and upper error limits and all that good stuff. So in the vein of let's do it right the first time, that could be something to consider, is to kind of do it right the first time and make sure that that's all considered in there. Alright, so from a sampling books and links point of view, I wanted to show you a few of the links that are available, and just give me a second here as we kind of scroll over. So this is one, just bringing my screen over here for you. So one thing that I think is a great book, the member price is $33.75. I could have sworn that this was discounted, but maybe, yep, it's on sale. It used to be $45, and they've dropped it down. Great book, and by Barbara Apostolou, and it just really does a nice job of not only explaining sampling, but also putting it from an internal auditor perspective. Quite a few tables and other things in the back to consider as well. We're going to be talking about him a little bit later, but we basically also have EZR stats, which I want to show you, and a product called WebCat. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. He's got some great guides, and we'll show you that in a second. But then a couple of other links here. One of them, I'm just going to try to copy and paste this so that I have it in Excel or in here. Give me one second. This is EZR stats and WebCat, which is a free software, and we're going to kind of show you that in a few minutes. But in the meantime, here is monetary unit sampling using Microsoft Excel. Again, just to give you some other perspective, I know this course is mostly about ACL today, but I did want to show you some of these other products because it does help to give you a better perspective of all the things on sampling and everything that's talked about, and it just helps maybe to better understand what's out there. So definitely take a look at this article as well, which is in the New York State Society of CPA journal, and does a great job of explaining it. And my last but not least one is that I can't download it or click on it right now, but the AICPA has a study guide, or the actual standard, on the sampling, and they also have study guides on this as well, which are quite good. You have to pay for those, but the actual standard is free, and you can read it, and they talk about all the sampling concepts and give an example, and I think you'll find that most useful, especially if you want to stay with the standards that are out there. That's pretty much the top standard on sampling right now from an audit perspective.